Hello, and welcome to Spilling the Milk, the podcast where we talk about breastfeeding. You know, the thing that moms have been doing since the beginning of time, and yet is still not really talked about as much as it needs to be. We're here to fix that. In today's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Sarah, who I have known since about the 7th or 8th grade, and she was my science lab partner all through high school. And we didn't always know what we were doing, but I feel like we usually figured it out. We made a pretty good team. And all these years later, to be talking with her, she's a mom of 2 boys. I'm a mom of 3 boys. We both are living our lives kind of geographically separated, but to be able to connect about our experiences with being moms and specifically with breastfeeding, it's really cool for me. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. I think you will enjoy, like I do, how Sarah sort of just does what she thinks is best and really paves her own path and figures things out for herself and doesn't really care what other people have to say about things in certain circumstances. I just love that. I think it's a kind of a refreshing perspective, especially on a topic where there are shelves and shelves of books you can read and lots of medical professionals who have opinions and ideas about what you should be doing. And for Sarah, she figures things out what works best for her and her family. All right. Well, Sarah, welcome. Thank you so much for talking with me today. If you want to first maybe start, just tell us a little bit about you, like how many kids you have, how old they are.
Sure. Well, I'm Sarah. I have 2 kids, 2 boys. Oliver is 4 and Jack is 2.5.
And so take us back to the very start of your breastfeeding journey it would be Oliver, your oldest.
I was thinking about this, and I recall that I was not doing a whole lot of planning before he was born about anything having to do with his care. I was just more in a state of it was too big and too amorphous of a thing for me to try to plan much about after he was born, and this includes breastfeeding. So I just kind of wanted to wait until he was born and then see how it all went, which I think maybe helped because I had very little, if any, expectations about how breastfeeding would go. I didn't have many friends in proximity to me who had babies, and so there wasn't anyone around that I could ask or, see, or that I was with on a routine basis who was breastfeeding. So it was just kind of okay, well, let's see how this goes. When he was born, obviously that's the focus moves to, okay, now you have to feed this baby. And I remember doing pretty well with it in the hospital. And then when we got home, things got a little bit more difficult following that for the next probably 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. I remember struggling pretty mightily with it, mostly because of the pain, not anything else. And then following that, and for the rest of his babyhood, and then my second baby, breastfeeding was absolutely the easiest thing, emotions aside, was the easiest thing for me. It just was I never found it to be difficult. I didn't have any problems with him, with either baby latching, with milk supply, with any of that. It was all fairly smooth sailing. Again, emotions aside.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about the emotions aside aspect then.
I guess what I didn't realize was when in the early stages of trying to breastfeed Oliver, when it was so difficult physically, I really wasn't paying attention too much to how difficult it was to just be the only person who could feed a baby, to have to be the on-demand parent all the time. And once the physical pain subsided, and then it just became sort of a routine of feeding whenever the baby needed to eat, I started to realize that actually this is very exhausting. This is exhausting. And in addition to, feeding it all the time, I also have to take care of it. And, it was quite a transition from being pregnant with no kids to having a kid that your responsibility is for feeding it all the time. Because we never used a bottle, and I managed to miss that boat on 2 occasions with 2 of my kids. They both only breastfed. And so to me, that was the most difficult part throughout, was just how much, how hard it was to have to just be available all the time when needed.
If you could go back, do you wish that giving a bottle had been an option?
I don't know if I could go, as I think about it in retrospect, no, because liked, I loved the experience of breastfeeding so much. I wouldn't want to change anything about either of my kids. And I'm proud and glad that I was able to structure my own life and work life in order to be available to them when they needed to eat all the time, or just as needed. So in retrospect, I wouldn't do anything different. I wonder if in the moment, if I had known better, sort of at the beginning of of Oliver's babyhood, that I might have tried to do it differently, because we did try. I certainly recall with him in particular buying all the bottles and, you know, trying all the different ways that you could possibly get a baby to take a bottle, and he wouldn't do it because I think we had just, again, that ship had sailed. But ultimately, I'm really glad about the way that it worked out. So I don't know if I would change it.
And you mentioned that you basically restructured your life so that you could continue nursing without, it sounds like, without pumping. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Again, I had absolutely no plans when I had Oliver. I was working at the time full time, and I intended to go back after a period of a maternity leave of just, 3 to 4 months seems normal. So that was sort of in my brain, and that was as planned as it got. And then I got to the end of that 3 or 4 months and decided I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stay with him, and continue to be home with him and breastfeed him. And I didn't know how I would balance work with that. And so I was able to negotiate with my employer to stay home on a longer leave. And I ended up actually leaving that job. The second baby that I had, so I actually didn't go back to work then until he was 11 months old. Oliver was 11 months old. And at that time, he was only feeding twice a day, basically in the morning and then in the evening before bedtime. And then Jack, my second, I was working for myself, so I was able to take as long of a leave as I wanted. And I ended up staying home with him, or carting him around with me, basically, as I tried to work until he was 8 months old. And then he went to daycare starting when he was about 8 or 9 months old. And I worked with the daycare for them to allow me to go in the middle of the day and feed him and then leave again, because at that time he would feed in the morning, in the middle of the day, and then I would need to be able to pick him up by about 3:30 to feed him again. And so that's how I had sort of an abbreviated working day from when he was about 8 months old to about a year, was when I stopped going in the middle of the day, and he was able to make it, all day long without breastfeeding. I was lucky. I count myself very lucky that I was able to flex my workday around the need to be physically present with my babies to feed them. I don't know what I would have done with them if I hadn't been able to do that, but ultimately I'm glad that it worked out the way that it did.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It sounds like you made it work for your family. That's fantastic. Since I know a bit about you, I know how you feel about pumping. Could you just tell us a little bit about your thoughts on pumping?
I hate pumping. I I actually, the physical act of it never bothered me. But it seemed like such a colossal waste of time when, why, I to me, my time was better spent actually feeding the baby, as opposed to, and working my life, which was not an easy feat, to work my life around being physically present to feed the baby. But I hated the idea that I was spending so much time pumping into a bottle so that somebody else could feed my child. And I never made it work in my brain how it would go so that I could feed my baby when I was with him all day long, but also somehow pump enough bottles to make it so that he could go to daycare all day without me going. To me, that never seemed, that's math that I know people figure out all the time, but I never wanted to actually spend the time to do that. So I had a pump. I did occasionally pump in order to have a bottle or two around in case we were gonna leave the house for 2 or 3 hours. There would be milk available for the grandparents or whoever was with the baby to, make an attempt at feeding the child, which never usually worked out. So I did do it on occasion, but I just thought this is not for me. I hate this. Why would I spend my time doing this when I could just be feeding my baby, which I like so much more? So that's how that's how I came to just basically put my breast pump on a shelf, and it collects dust to this day.
Yes, I understand. I think we're similar in that we hate inefficiency. And I remember having the same thoughts that if I'm going to spend 30 minutes getting this milk into the bottle, and in that same 30 minutes, the milk could have gone into the baby already. Like, this is just, we're doubling the amount of time. And when you're pumping, like, I mean, some people are really good at having their hands free, but as a mom, like, you just need your hands free all the time, unless you're nursing. So it's like, I can't give up my hands. I can't give up my time. So I'm with you there.
Exactly.
So our podcast is called Spilling the Milk, and for a lot of moms, that brings up some really bad memories. Did that ever happen to you? I mean, if you weren't pumping, maybe it didn't really happen. Did you ever have any sort of nursing disasters?
No. The only times that I had disasters were, one, I had mastitis once, which was terrible. Actually, no, I had it a couple of times. After I had it the first time, I realized you can actually get the baby to save you and just, breastfeed and massage the spot that's troublesome. And I was able to, I think when I had it with Jack once or maybe twice, it resolved on its own because I was able to relieve myself of the blockage. But the first time that I got it and didn't know any better, it was very, very miserable. So I'll say that, I guess that was a disaster. The only other times that I really ran into problems at all was if I did have to go do something for some period of time and I couldn't take my baby and had to leave him, there basically was no way for the baby to be fed when each of them was very little and they weren't eating any solid foods or anything else like that until I was back. And so I remember on one occasion in particular that I had some work I had to do and I had to go to this meeting, and I left my oldest with my mom, and he was probably 3 months old. And the meeting ran long, and I was trying to get out of there so I could get back to my mom and my baby because I knew he would be needing to eat, and I could physically tell he was needing to eat. And yeah, I would think there was probably a good 20 or 30 minutes that he was just screaming his head off for my mom because all he wanted to do was eat, and she couldn't help him. Nobody could help him until I got back. So it was, situations like that were the disasters for me. But no, without having to had gotten into any of the bottles and the pumping and the needing to create stores and any of that, I never got into any of those issues.
Yeah, your the mastitis, that sounds similar. I know the first time I had it, I think I got antibiotics prescribed because I thought that's what you were supposed to do. But then the second time, whoever I talked to, probably a midwife, said, if you can resolve it on your own with extra feeding and massaging and all that, like that's an option. I didn't know it could resolve on its own, like without antibiotics, I guess.
Right. I didn't realize that until I like went to the internet. And the first time, I think it came on so fast that I didn't know, wasn't aware of what it felt like and what the symptoms were and any of that. So when it came on, I didn't even realize what was happening until I was very ill. The second time it happened, I was a little bit more aware, and I had I had Googled it immediately, how I could relieve this on my own, and it went away on its own.
That's awesome. Yeah, I remember it is kind of funny because you have one relationship with your baby where like you are the caregiver and like you're taking care of your baby. And then when you need your baby to like get this milk out and like get this clogged duct out, you're like, okay, baby, I need you to do your job now.
Right. And luckily, I never had a problem with either of my kids in that regard. They were happy to nurse like all the time. I just never had it. Most of the time, the problem was that they would just nurse forever. And it was like, okay, I've got stuff to do now. Please, let's let's separate ourselves now. But I never had a problem with either of them in that regard. So they were both happy to make themselves available when needed for that purpose.
That's a good, baby. Thank you for being helpful.
Right.
I mean, it's the least they can do, but
That's right.
Yeah. Was that something that surprised you at the beginning, was how often and maybe for how long nursing sessions could go? I feel like the doctors give you this chart like, oh, they might want to nurse once every 2 to 3 hours. And then how did your experience compare with that little chart?
Yeah, I was remembering that just recently that when we brought Oliver home, we continued this charting that they began with us in the hospital, which is to keep track of every single time he nursed, on what side, for how long. And so we continued trying to do that when we got home. I think for no other reason than it helped just with the anxiety, because I don't know that I ever got to the point where I was looking at the time and saying, "Oh, it's time for my baby to eat." I basically followed his cues all the way through, to the point where I remember my husband was like, "I think that you're feeding him too much. Like, should he really be eating this much?" And we happened to go to our pediatrician right around that time for his 2 or 4 month appointment. And the pediatrician, who is a man, says, no, he only needs to eat for about, 10 minutes at a time, or whatever was the advice, which was much shorter than the amount of time that my baby was spending eating. And I just said, like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care. I don't care what the doctor says. This is what I'm going to do. This is what the baby seems to need, or seems to want. That's fine with me. I don't care. Certainly, my personality is, I want to know exactly how a thing works so that I can be prepared for and then do what is required of me. And so when they tell you at the hospital it's going to be every 2 to 3 hours, I very much was paying attention to the clock and things like that at the beginning, and trying to figure out. Luckily, my oldest has always sort of followed the prescriptions for, what babies should do and when. So he was very much on this timeline. I guess I wasn't really surprised how often. What was more of an adjustment was actually doing that. Like, oh yeah, so that continues through the night. We're going to be waking up every 2 to 3 hours through the night to do this. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you were able to just listen to the doctor and say thanks, no thanks, and do your own thing. But I worry about people who take that advice as the truth and then cut their baby off after 10 minutes because they're going too long, or say like, oh no, we nursed an hour and 45 minutes ago. It hasn't been 2 hours. Like, you have to wait and just, let me try to distract you with something else. So I kind of worry about people that take that approach and are trying to follow the advice. And like you said, you found success when you're just like, nope, I'm going to pay attention to my baby. Baby seems hungry. We're going to nurse.
Right. And who cares if the baby's nursing for comfort and not for food? To me, that didn't bother me. And I imagine, a lot of it was that. And at the beginning, I did have some anxiety about, am I overfeeding him? Or, what, are we comfort nursing right now? Or do you actually need to eat? But eventually I realized that it was just easier to go along with the little baby's cues and his needs. And that made him a happier baby. And that was fine with me. And, there was never any feedback from the pediatrician that your baby's not healthy or not doing well or not gaining weight, or everything looks fine. Okay, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. To me, it seems odd that a doctor would prescribe something like that. No, he should be done after 10 minutes. Don't let him comfort nurse, was sort of the impression that I got. That was always my focus, was just what did he seem to need? And both of them needed that differently. Both of my kids needed that differently. One, my younger, was way more into comfort nursing. And he's always been a more physically affectionate child, even after we've been done. But he needed that way more than my first, it seemed like, and he nursed way longer. I think it differs from baby to baby, but certainly I think the baby should lead at that point.
And you bring up a good point that just because you've nursed your first baby, you don't necessarily know what to expect with the second one. So with Jack at the beginning, did you experience like the same amount of pain, or like was that first part different? or was it like starting all over again?
I don't remember any pain with Jack. I think it was like picking up where I left off. I didn't have any problems with him latching. He was a really big baby when he was born, and he was kind of zoned out for about the first 24 hours, and didn't eat a lot in that first 24 hours. But after that, he was absolutely just easy. He figured it out. We figured it out pretty quickly. And then from then on, it was just, I didn't have any of the same anxiety or pain like I did the first time around, because I was more comfortable with, okay, from the start, I'm just going to do whatever, whatever baby needs and what he wants and when he wants it. And that should be good enough. And it was. He seemed like he liked to nurse a lot. And so we did nursing a lot, which was okay because I frankly really enjoy it. So it was sort of a relaxing time for me to be able to spend with him. Of course, minus the times when you're like, okay, I've got stuff to do, or I need two hands right now. Those times aside, it was really nice, but he definitely was more demanding than was my first.
Were you able to get in any good like Netflix binging with either kid? I know, because for me, it's like when I think back on that time, I was on the couch with a baby in my lap for hours and hours and hours, and I'm pretty sure I just got hooked on daytime television.
Yes, I remember those days very fondly. Of course, I'm thinking only about the good parts of it, which is that, yeah, you become very familiar with the daytime television lineup. And also binged several shows on Netflix. Yeah, I just, at again, with the first one, I felt like I shouldn't, this is not the right thing to do. Should I just be sitting around with my baby all day, like just feeding him all day long, or, putting him to sleep? And, don't I need to be doing 100 other things? And by the time I got to the second one, it was like, nope, I'm going to settle right into this, just hanging out, hanging out all day long with you in the living room. And, and that ended up being a lot less stressful and anxiety provoking the second time around, when I was just able to, from the beginning, have the expectation that this is all we're going to do.
Yeah, it's like you kind of gave yourself permission to just enjoy it.
Right.
So if let's say you're going to go back to your 8.5 months pregnant, first time mom self, and you could give yourself advice knowing what you know now about breastfeeding, what would you tell yourself?
Oh boy. I think that my sort of overall advice is just to be really patient with yourself and with the learning process, and just give yourself a lot of breaks. And I mean, sort of from the expectations that you have from yourself, for yourself, because I think I and a lot of moms have a lot of expectations, or develop a lot of expectations, and there are a lot of external expectations about what you should be doing. And all of that to me is just inconsequential and really sets you up for a lot more stress and anxiety than you need when you're going through an enormous life transition and physical transition, an emotional transition. And it's just a lot easier if you can tune out all of that outside noise and just do what feels best for you and for your baby. And if that means that you only bottle feed, or if that means that you only formula feed, or if that means that, it just isn't working, it's too stressful. To me, that's what I would try and remind myself. I think I would have still had to maybe learn the hard way, just because of my own personality, that it would really serve me better to just, listen to my own intuition and my own baby about what's the best thing for us. But that really was the starkest difference for me between baby one and baby two. Was by the time I got to baby two, I really felt like I know how to do this. I don't need anybody else's advice about this. Or if I do, and when I do, I will go ask for it from somebody who I trust. And otherwise, I don't really need to listen to anybody else about how to do this, because I think innately I know the best way to take care of this baby, and I can do that. I'm equipped to do that.
Yeah, it's tough though. Like you said, you can say all this in hindsight because you have this experience and you went through it. I think, like you're saying at the beginning, you sort of go into it like, how can you have realistic expectations if you've never gone through it? It's unlike anything you've done before.
Right. I'm really glad, and I think it worked out, that I tried not to have any expectations for myself and for the whole maternity leave and beyond, because I just didn't know what to expect. And I was nervous that it would set me up for some result that I couldn't achieve. But it ended up sort of taking me in the right direction, which is that I think you have to just sort of take your hands off the wheel at some point and just let the process go, let things evolve as they do, have patience with how long it takes you to learn how to do this, because when you're a new mom, you're learning all the things and it takes a long time and you can't know all the answers right away. You just have to evolve, in the process of becoming a mom. I'm still doing that, and I still tell myself that I'm still in this process of evolution, and I have to be patient with myself and how long it takes to learn these things, because they're important things to learn. It's not anything that you can just know right from the outset. So I continue to try to live by that advice.
I'm with you. I thought maybe I could be done learning, okay, the baby's like 2, 3 years old, like I'm done. But then it turns out like even when they become teenagers, you have to like learn new things. So
Right.
we're never done.
Right.
All right. My last question is about nursing in public. Did you, if you weren't using bottles, it seems like you probably had to nurse in public sometimes. Any especially crazy places that you nursed in public, or any experiences with that?
I never had any bad experiences nursing in public, and I'm glad for that. I remember I went on a plane trip or two with little babies, and I remember on one occasion when I was by myself flying somewhere, and it was a tiny plane, and so it's just 2 seats on either side, and I had this enormous, like, gruff man sitting next to me, and I thought, oh no, just like immediately thought he's gonna be weirded out by me breastfeeding my baby next to him, because the plan was, I'll just breastfeed at takeoff and then the baby will be asleep the rest of the way. I kind of said some comments to him ahead of the takeoff. Okay, this is what I plan to do, and hopefully it'll make the baby quiet. Oh, I totally understand. He says, my kids, same thing with my wife and all of this. Okay. I mean, it was really for me, I never had any bad experience. It was more just, I really, really appreciated the people in public who were actively supportive. And so I try to do that now when I see other parents breastfeeding in public, is to be actively supported.
Well, it was a good story about a good experience nursing in public, which is also helpful. And like you said, like you hadn't really seen it in real life. Like you didn't have close friends that you could have to sort of normalize it for you ahead of time. So I think anything you can do to normalize it for future generations is always a positive. All right, Sarah. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. This was great.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to recap a few things that came out of the conversation. The first is that Sarah really made her own path. She sort of merged her career path and her mom path to support her breastfeeding goals and just the way she wanted to handle motherhood. And she'll be the first to admit that that's a privilege to be in a position to even have that as an option. But I do think it's interesting to hear about it and maybe just consider that breastfeeding can work around your schedule, or you can modify your schedule or your career for that portion if it's something that you want to do. We also talked about mastitis, which is not fun, and the fact that sometimes you can relieve it yourself without having to take antibiotics. So that's just something to be aware of. There are resources out there that talk about the ways to prevent and then treat mastitis, and it's good to know about them in case that comes up. And I think it's also good to just realize Sarah she describes it as a really easy time nursing both kids, and I love how she describes it. She told me it's the best thing she's ever done. But even with a really overall positive experience, she had challenges. She had mastitis at least once, and then, the first time nursing, she had some pain. So just to know that there's going to be ups and downs and that it can still have an overall very positive experience. I like when she told me about the doctor saying, trying to dictate how often the baby should be nursing and for how long. And she was like, yeah, cool. I'm just going to do what seems to be working for me and my baby. You can keep your advice over there. So I enjoyed that part. I also liked her story about breastfeeding on the airplane and how the person next to her was completely supportive and it was a great experience. We definitely see the stories where moms are shamed for nursing in public, particularly on airplanes or in travel situations. And I can't understand it. And I think it's important that we do normalize breastfeeding in public and we do support moms that are doing this because we know it's already hard enough without other people inserting their opinions or their shaming. So I'm glad that she had positive experiences, and I hope that we can all support moms that we do see nursing in public. One story Sarah shared with me, of course, after I stopped recording, was that one time she had to bring the baby with her to a mediation, and it actually ended up being a positive because with the baby in the room, everyone involved was just a little bit calmer and a little bit more respectful towards one another because it's harder to yell at your spouse that you're divorcing when there's a cute little baby sitting across the table from you. So she just had that interesting experience of the sense of calm that a baby can bring to an otherwise stressful situation. I thought that was a really cute illustration of how she wasn't afraid to combine her baby and her work. Once again, it was such a treat to get to talk with Sarah and to be able to connect with her about this important part of both of our lives. And I encourage you, if you have old friends or new friends, to reach out, connect, and have the conversation. That's it for this episode of Spilling the Milk. If you're enjoying these conversations, please leave us a review and tell a friend. That's the best way for us to grow our community and let more moms know that they're not alone. We're in this together. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast and share your story, please send an email to spillingthemilkpodcast@gmail.com.